Hello and welcome to the IR special session once again. Today we are going to discuss the Gaza ceasefire. But before we do that, we will talk about background first. Then I will talk about India's foreign policy on what has happened ever since Hamas attacked Israel. India's foreign policy was incrementally advanced. We will talk about that fact as well, how India read the situation and how the foreign policy was incrementally advanced. We would then talk about the ceasefire, different stages which are decided, what has happened so far, what is impending to happen. We would talk about what factors led to this ceasefire eventually. We would also talk about the PSI dimension to the whole topic. Let us begin with the background first. Hamas attacked Israel on 7th of October 2023, as we all know. What was India's response to this event? India quickly condemned terror attacks, quote unquote, and expressed solidarity with Israel. This is based on Prime Minister Modi's tweet on X. The MEA spokesperson clarified India's stand in a short while. The statements of MEA official spokesperson Arindam Bagchi was that India considers Hamas attack to be a terrorist attack. So he reiterated Prime Minister Modi's description of what happened. He again reiterated also the commitment to long-standing policy of India in terms of support for sovereign, independent, and more importantly, viable state of Palestine. India incrementally advanced foreign policy response to the outbreak of full-blown war. Let me repeat this again. The whole development started with Hamas attack on Israel, and then after that attack, the entire development went towards a full-blown war. We will talk about India's foreign policy response to what happened. First of all, India stood alone in the global south in not voting in favor of a ceasefire at UNGA. That's an interesting development. India did not vote in favor of ceasefire at UNGA, number one. Number two, when the devastating humanitarian crisis unfolded in Gaza, India officially tried to strike a balance by sending aid to the people of Gaza on one hand and raising concerns about civilian deaths and expressing support for ending hostilities and resolving the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. That is how India responded. On one hand, giving support to humanitarian aid to the Gaza people, and on the other hand, hoping for early end to the entire conflict through diplomacy and dialogue. So initially, India did not vote in favor of ceasefire. That looked like sort of pro-Israel kind of a stand. Then India talked about ending hostilities as early as possible through dialogue and diplomacy. In November 2023, India abstained on UNHRC, Human Rights Council resolution on HR violations, human rights violations in Israel-occupied Palestinian territories that called for immediate ceasefire and arms embargo on Israel. So again, a specific resolution asking Israel to stop the war, plus to stop the human rights violations during the war, and then arms embargo as well. So India was abstaining on this resolution as well. That again looked like sort of a pro-Israel kind of stand. We will talk about the analysis once we look at what how India responded rather to different things which unfolded in Gaza war. In December 2023, India voted in favor of ceasefire resolution at UN eventually, right, and reaffirmed a traditional call for a two-state solution, right? We need to understand this. Initially, India was not in favor of ceasefire. India thought that that would go against Israel. When that war became full-blown war, that is where India voted in favor of ceasefire resolution at UN, right? However, India did not vote for even HRC resolution that in a way criticizes Israel. Indian government registered calls from civil society organizations, human rights activists, and former bureaucrats to stop some Indian companies from exporting arms to Israel. The UNHRC resolution, which called for embargo on Israel in terms of war deals, here HR activists, certain civil society organizations, bureaucrats were hoping that government of India would put some pressure on Indian companies exporting arms to Israel. India did not do so. Some analysts have argued that based on this, there is complicity in Israel's genocidal war on Gaza on the part of those Indian companies. So Indian companies are complicit. They're not looking at what is unfolding because of their arms supplies to Israel. Minister of External Affairs S. Jaishankar defended Indian government's traditional stand on Israel-Palestine conflict and reaffirmed support for establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state. What he said, contrary to the popular perception, he stated that India's support and aid to the people of Palestine has increased under the Modi government. However, India abstained on UN resolution that called on Israel to end illegal occupation of Palestine within a year. Maybe India was more concerned about the timeline and the kind of pressure that would build on Israel. Summing up, India seems to have adopted more nuanced position on the war and seeks space to maneuver when it comes to Israel-Palestine conflict. So we are looking for that maneuvering space as well. Many analysts looking at these developments and how India responded, many analysts say that India's responses to Gaza crisis, different responses that we saw, is deeply problematic and largely supportive of Israel. There are some analysts who say that these responses are deeply problematic and largely supportive of Israel. This view is based on a precedent. This is a critical view. It is based on a precedent, what has happened in the past. In June 2019, India voted in support of Israel at ECOSOC, the UN Economic Social Council, to deny observer status to Palestinian human rights organization. So, ECOSOC was looking forward to allow observer status to Palestinian human rights organization. We know that Palestine has not got the membership of UNO yet. That is why observer status. India did not support this resolution. This is seen as first step away from the two-state theory, right? Some analysts see it in this manner. In 2019, what India did, what human rights organization, right? So it clearly indicates India stepping away from two-state theory. This is what some analysts consider. However, India did not invite displeasure of Gulf or Arab countries. If we assume that India is, stepping away from two-state theory, or India is becoming a little bit pro-Israel kind of a nation, despite this, India did not invite displeasure from Gulf or Arab countries. Why? A number of reasons. One, Israel is now ever more integrated into the region since Abraham Accords were signed. The picture is not that simple now, Israel versus rest of the Arab countries. Now, Israel itself is very much part of that regional integration happening since Abraham Accords, number one. Number two, many Arab countries today have established formal diplomatic relations with Israel, and those who haven't, they see it as future partner. They see Israel as future partner. And based on this observation, Indian foreign policy establishment read these developments very well and acted accordingly to secure India's interest in the region. That's why we are saying that India's foreign policy has been quite nuanced one towards the Gaza war and different things which unfolded in Gaza war. So this is the background and analysis of India's foreign policy towards Gaza war. Let us now talk about the ceasefire. According to BBC News, the ceasefire was announced on 15 January and began 4 days later. So after 4 days of the announcement, the ceasefire began. We need to understand that this was a result of months of negotiations, right, led by US, Qatar, and Egypt. It is based on a personal determination on the part of Joe Biden that is being said. It was based on a proposal which came by Biden, now the former president, in May 2024. He proposed this idea of ceasefire in May 2024. The deal will be carried out in 3 stages. Let us talk about those 3 stages of the ceasefire. Stage 1, which is supposed to last for 42 days, which is going on right now. What are the provisions under stage 1 of the ceasefire? First, there will be a complete ceasefire. So both Hamas and Israel have to ensure that this complete ceasefire, number 1. Number 2, Hamas will release a total of 33 hostages. A total of 33 hostages. Women, female soldiers included, children, some older men, and the sick. The Hindu has already given the status of the hostages. There are few who have died. There are 33 to be released, and there are few who are living hostages. We will talk about what is decided about living hostages in a short while. So, women, including female soldiers, children, some older men, and the sick would be released as part of release of those 33 hostages, and the whole procedure would be carried out through the Red Cross. Israel will release about 1,900 Palestinian prisoners as part of the provision of ceasefire, right? Israeli forces will leave populated areas, the next provision. They would leave populated areas in Gaza. Displaced Palestinian civilians will be allowed to return to their neighborhoods, next provision. Hundreds of aid lorries will be allowed into Gaza each day. Next, Israeli troops will remain in Gaza's border areas, including the southern Philadelphia corridor, but will leave the Netzarim corridor, a military zone cutting off the north of Gaza from the south. So that zone Israel has to evacuate, right? It would remain in border regions. These are provisions under the stage 1 of the ceasefire. Let us look at the provisions under stage 2, which is supposed to begin 16 days after the start of stage 1. What would be the points of negotiation for stage 2? First, to establish a permanent ceasefire. So the provisional complete ceasefire according to stage 1, right? Once stage 1 starts implementation, after 16 days, this would be discussed, in which there would be negotiation on establishing a permanent ceasefire, number 1. Number 2, this negotiation would also talk about exchange of remaining living hostages in Gaza, right? For more Palestinian prisoners to be released by Israel, right? Third point would be to ensure complete withdrawal of Israeli forces. So these are 3 points which are to be discussed under stage 2 of the ceasefire. The stage 3, which would be the final part of the agreement, in this stage 3, 2 points will be discussed. 1, the return of all remaining bodies of the dead hostages. Let me repeat the hostages part. 33 would be released as part of stage 1, right? The remaining living hostages would be released as part of stage 2, and bodies of dead hostages would be released as part of stage 3. Apart from this, stage 3 will also have a discussion on reconstruction of Gaza. Obviously, that is expected to take number of years, reconstruction of Gaza, right? We talked about 3 stages of ceasefire. Let us talk about what led to ceasefire. This is analytical part. According to New York Times and The Hindu, what all factors led to ceasefire? First, representatives of Egypt, Qatar, and the Biden administration as mediators met frequently with the warring parties, that is Hamas and Israel, in Cairo, Doha, and several European capitals throughout 2024. What pushed the deal over the line in January this year was the unlikely partnership between envoys of American current and future presidents, because America, the United States of America, was going through the transition of power, Biden administration to Trump administration. So both presidents and their envoys were engaged in the discussions. They both were working in tandem with the Qatari Prime Minister in marathon late night meetings so that the ceasefire can be reached on. Ceasefire agreement can be worked out. While Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump have competed for the credit, that is what politicians generally do, the reality is that their representatives were both crucial to the final push. Both are trying to get the credit, but both their negotiators were playing an important role. Each of them, each negotiator of Biden and of Trump, were using different approaches to push the Israeli leadership towards a deal, while Sheikh Mohammed of Qatar was focusing on dealing with Hamas, right? We would talk about what was the approach of both of them, of envoy of Biden and that of Donald Trump. Thomas Nides, who happens to be a former US ambassador to Israel, has stated that pressure from all 3 sides was required in order to bring these 2 parties to ceasefire. That is pressure from Arab world, pressure from Biden, and pressure from Trump. Mr. McGurk, who happens to be Biden's negotiator, right, in this entire negotiation, helped draft the deal's complicated details. That is the contribution coming from Biden's envoy. While Trump's representative, Mr. Witkoff, was instrumental in persuading Israel to finally agree to the deal's contents. And it was Sheikh Mohammed of Qatar who persuaded Hamas to make key compromises so that the deal goes through, while providing both sides with office, the space to work out the final details of the agreement, right? Hamas and also Hezbollah in Lebanon have had their capacities diminished over the past years after leadership decapitation operations conducted by Israel. Israel has eliminated a few of the leaders of Hamas and Israel. Now they are sort of weakened a bit. So apart from the efforts put in by those three countries and their leaders and their negotiators, we have to take into consideration this aspect as well in order to understand as to why the ceasefire eventually was arrived at. So Hamas and Hezbollah both are in a way weakened a bit because some of their top leaderships are eliminated by Israel. Another important factor, Syrian crisis and overthrow of Bashar al-Assad regime, which used to provide an important entry point for Iran in Levant region, right? Levant region is a region which is adjoining to Mediterranean Ocean. So Iran used to enter through Syria into this region and used to play an important role. We know Iran is a crucial part of what is called axis of resistance along with Hamas and Hezbollah. So weakening of this axis of resistance might be one of the reasons as to why Hamas felt compelled to go for the ceasefire. This is about analysis of ceasefire, what factors contribute to ceasefire. Let us now talk about what is India's stand on the ceasefire briefly and implications for India briefly. India welcomed the ceasefire. Ministry of External Affairs issued a statement. What are the important points of the statement? Number one, MEA said that we have consistently called for release of all hostages, ceasefire, and return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy. MEA issued a short statement. First statement of that entire statement was this one, that India always stood for release of hostages, all hostages, ceasefire as early as possible, and resolution of the conflict through path of dialogue and diplomacy. MEA also hoped that agreement would lead to a safe, sustained supply of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. So this was the statement of MEA as far as ceasefire is concerned. Let us now briefly talk about what implications this Gaza ceasefire may have on India. That may require another session maybe to discuss things in detail, but it's too early to comment on that. That's why I have kept it to minimum, short kind of understanding. Positive implications for newer geoeconomic architectures such as IMEC, right? That is India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, and I2U2. We need to understand this. These are geoeconomic, geostrategic kind of architectures which are developing in Middle East, and for the first time, India is very much part of what is happening in Middle East, geo-economically speaking, geostrategically speaking, right? But it is too early to assess the positive implications that we are talking about because ceasefire is still in process, number one. Number two, there are numerous challenges already, right, which may derail the entire ceasefire process. We will talk more about that, right? Let us now add that PSI dimension. Let us discuss this topic a little bit in detail. First of all, let us look at the analysis by Kabir Taneja, who wrote about this issue on the ORF Online. According to Kabir Taneja, in Washington, D.C., Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden reportedly worked in unison to deliver the deal, even both tried to lap up the credit. We have mentioned that already. For Mr. Trump, who previously demanded that such a deal be reached before his presidency, this was a marketable advertising of renewed American strength as promised in his election campaign, argues Kabir Taneja. So it's sort of a advertisement point for Donald Trump. For Mr. Biden, it is an attempt to salvage his legacy, to save his legacy. I left something as a legacy. That is how Biden was looking at it, right? Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to deal because he wanted to send a message of partnership and resolve to the upcoming administration and to Mr. Trump personally. That's an interesting kind of argument coming from Mr. Kabir Taneja. Kabir Taneja says that Mr. Trump prioritizes personality over policy, and that is why this message was sent by Netanyahu to Trump. That is to agree, by agreeing to the deal, he was sending a message to Trump. Agreeing to this deal with Hamas is offering Mr. Trump a victory at potentially big domestic cost for Mr. Netanyahu. Netanyahu has decided to send a message to Trump at a big cost domestically. What is that? For long, Mr. Netanyahu has maintained that only a complete victory over Hamas is acceptable. Now he is sort of compromising with Hamas. Domestically, he may face challenges from the ultra-rights, right? With this deal, he becomes an Israeli prime minister who has cut a political statement with arch foe, that is Hamas, but without a complete elimination of Hamas. That's a sort of compromise he is doing. He may face certain domestic challenges. What are the challenges to ceasefire in general, according to Kabir Taneja? First, the lack of a political track acting as an insurance for the ceasefire remains a concern. Do we have any kind of political track where all the stakeholders can sit and discuss? No. Hamas has been engaged separately by Qatar, and Israel has been engaged separately by US administrations, the concluding one and the upcoming one, right? Hamas is expected to continue to be in control of Gaza in the time to come because barely any movements have taken place to reorganize Palestinian politics in a way where the group can be brought under a wider and more mainstream kind of Palestinian-led political ecosystem. We do not see anything happening in terms of reconstructing Palestinian state and the politics. So Hamas may have control over the Gaza in coming months or years. We need to also understand that there is challenge in terms of antithetical ideological positions as well. What do we understand by this? What Kabir Taneja has to say? Hamas by itself will remain steadfast in its ideology against Israeli security and sovereignty. That is what they have been talking about since long. While Hamas and Israel continue to remain on the same page against the two-state solution. So Hamas wants to eliminate Israel and wants single state of Palestine. That has been their ideology since long. Israel also is opposed to two-state solution. So both of them share two-state solution in an antagonistic manner. Third aspect, ideological antagonism. Third aspect, despite a global push for a two-state solution, right? The only viable option for lasting peace is this one. All these countries, though they are trying to bring these parties to negotiation for two-state solution, despite those efforts, it is difficult because there is ideological antagonism between Israel and Hamas, right? The prevailing situation can be leveraged by Netanyahu. Third challenge, right? The prevailing situation can be leveraged by Netanyahu in case Hamas resumes attacks on Israel. If this happens in such a case, right, in all likeliness, he may get full support from Mr. Donald Trump, as Netanyahu had agreed to the ceasefire deal to send a message to Mr. Trump. We have talked about that, right? And Mr. Trump has publicly stated that there would be hell to pay for Hamas if hostages were not released. So this statement, and Netanyahu was sort of sending a message to Trump, in case of future Hamas attacks, these two may come together. Further challenges, apart from what Kabir Taneja says, what are the other challenges? Netanyahu is facing competing pressure from his right-wing coalition. I just touched this topic in the previous section. Netanyahu is facing competing pressure from his right-wing coalition to end a temporary truce against Hamas militants in Gaza and from war-weary Israelis who want the remaining hostages to come to home and for the war to end. So he has these two competing pressures. On one hand, there is right-wing group which is pushing for the war. On the other hand, there are war-weary soldiers and people who are looking forward to ceasefire and bringing our hostages to home as early as possible. Another factor which may challenge this entire process of ceasefire is vagaries of Mr. Donald Trump. Number of times he makes statements which are a bit different than what he said earlier, and that unsettles many things, right? Trump's remarks that displaced Palestinians should be permanently settled outside Gaza and the US should take ownership of the redeveloping the area. This remark again sparked a row. His remarks drew swift opposition and were certain to spoil the ceasefire talks between Hamas and Israel, right? Hamas, in response, right, postponed the release of more hostages until further notice. So, one statement from Donald Trump and there is negative consequence for the ceasefire. This statement in response by Hamas threatens to derail the entire truce, right? Hamas cited the reason that Israel is violating the terms of ceasefire, including by not allowing enough tents and other aid into Gaza. We saw that in the stage 1 itself, it was Israel's responsibility to ensure the supply of humanitarian aid to Palestine, right? So Hamas alleges that Israel is not doing enough on that provision of the ceasefire agreement. Trump said that he is confident of persuading Jordan and Egypt to take in some 2.3 million displaced Palestinians from Gaza. That's interesting kind of a stand on the part of Trump. Domestically, he talks about, sort of expelling the illegal migrants, and he is tightening the immigration policy. And then he expects Jordan and Egypt to take some 2.3 million Palestinian people into their territories, right? In response, a joint statement came from Jordan and Egypt. What was it? Any plan that encouraged the transfer or uprooting of Palestinians from their land would threaten stability in the region, spread conflict, and undermine the prospect of peace. That is how the joint statement clearly responded to Trump's statement of Jordan and Egypt taking Palestinian refugees or displaced people, right? Saudi Foreign Affairs reaffirmed Riyadh's complete rejection of any infringement on the legitimate rights of Palestinian people, whether through Israeli settlement policies, annexation of Palestinian lands, or attempts to displace the Palestinian people from their lands. So far, ever since Donald Trump became president, he seems to be alienating the allies of US because of his statements, which often create a lot of problems for the allies. And that's why vagaries of Trump is an important factor which may derail the entire process. Trump said that Israel should cancel the entire ceasefire if all the hostages aren't freed by Saturday. Hamas brushed off this threat and warned that it would only continue releasing hostages if all parties adhere to the ceasefire. Another statement of Trump putting the ceasefire in jeopardy. Now let us look at what John Mearsheimer had to say regarding the entire development, right? Mearsheimer clearly stated that in his theory that states are power maximizers. So he would analyze the whole Gaza war based on that. Mearsheimer called Israel's Gaza war as genocide in Gaza. He did not mince his words. He was pretty much clear. He said this is genocide in Gaza. Mearsheimer described Israel's policies in Gaza and West Bank as amounting to apartheid state that is observed in South Africa in second half of 20th century, formally speaking, right? Mearsheimer, while talking about his theory, also acknowledged limitations to his structural realism theory. That is an interesting development. He accepted limitations to structural realism theory. Just to put things clear for the PSI students, structural realism comes up with structural determinism, where there is almost no scope for individual leadership, right? Here, Mearsheimer acknowledges that his structural realism downplays the influence of leaders or domestic politics in explaining state behavior. What Kenneth Waltz said was a structural realist prior to Mearsheimer. There are three levels of analysis. That is systemic level, that is structural level, then the domestic level and leadership level. And Kenneth Waltz said that domestic and leadership level factors do not matter. What matters is structure. But now, looking at what is happening and how individual leaders have sort of bearing on foreign policy and kind of impact they make on the foreign policy, Mearsheimer now concedes that these two levels of analysis are equally important. That's it for now. Thank you.